I want to start with this term, the miracle on the Han River. What does this term mean to you? Do you like this term? What is the miracle? How do you explain it? What does this term mean to you, Sojin?
Before you actually asked this question, to be honest, I haven't thought about it deeply, how miracle really means to me, because, my background, before I became the academic, I used to work for the aid agency in Korea, which is basically sending out development aid to other developing countries. And I had a chance to visit many other developing countries. And more, I saw how a country developed. How South Korea developed really came to me something enormous. I would not define it as a miracle, because miracle is something comes to me without any plan or efforts, but just come all of a sudden. But in the case of South Korea's economic development, I know that there were a lot of sacrifice. For example, my parents' generation, I know how they sacrificed for their children. Many people really worked hard, and even my generation, we really have worked hard. So it is really based on the people to sacrifice efforts, their will, a lot of plans or dreams. And then they achieved this relatively fast development in economic terms in South Korea. But when I see other countries, it's really, really not easy task to achieve this level of economic development within that short time period for a country. So maybe because of that, people began to call it a miracle and just accept it without sensitive kind of investigation or consideration. But yeah, now I think it consider whether we can call it as a miracle or not. As I said, if I think about these all efforts and people's dreams and wills, how they provide their inputs to this country's economic development, certainly it's not like miracle. It's really the result of people's efforts.
I agree with you, by the way, that the effort, it didn't just happen. There was blood, sweat and tears went into this. Does the same expression get used in Korean? I'm suddenly curious, because in English, in the English language discourse, miracle on the Han River is very common. I'm just wondering, you mentioned your parents and their sacrifices, yours. Does the same term get translated into Korean, or is it described another way?
So the miracle of the Han River is more or less about the academic term. So we have the term which is literally called 한강의 기적, which means Han River's miracle. But in a daily conversation, we normally don't use that term. So I don't recall any of the conversation which I had with my colleagues or friends or my parents about this economic development. We barely talk about miracle of the Han River, but whenever we talk within the work frame with the officials from other countries, then we talk about it. Or in the academic papers in Korean, we talk about 한강의 기적, but not in the daily conversation. No.
No, that does make sense. It's just, it's a catchphrase, I think, for academia sometimes to make things look good. I want to get into this transformation that South Korea went through. At the start, Sojin, you mentioned this idea of developing countries and giving aid. Are those terms still cool to use, like developing, developed, semi-developed? Is it like global north? I'm never quite sure. And I know language is important. Are those terms still cool?
Very good question. As a matter of fact, we really have a lot of changes in terms of using terms. Before, you may recall that we used the term of first, second, and third world.
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Based on this ideological approach. But we don't use these terms anymore, at least in the development studies discipline, because my background is development studies. And in practice, whenever I met officials from developing countries or the international conference within the UN, for example, finance conference and stuff, there were a lot of tries not to use these terms in a way, for example, recipient country or donor country, then, it automatically sets the powers between givers and the receivers, right?
Yeah.
So that's why they try to now use the term of partner countries. And by using that, try not to use developing or developed countries as a term. And, there are no such countries developed, all countries are developing. And, I'm situated in the UK, and as I see, even though the income level is really high as a country, I still see homeless people. I still see people who are really poor. I see people who are really economically struggling in this country, which now we call new bottom billion. So before, when you call developing countries, it was more about in the globe, bottom billion in the south, right? But nowadays we see new bottom billion, which means these poor population within each country. In China, in India, if you see, it's a lot. So people try to see alternatives rather than put this developed or developing. But when we say partner countries, then now it becomes really confusing. Which partner? Is it like a high income partner or low income partner? So that's why people tend to go back to the old rhetoric, putting developing countries to get things to understand easier. So it really depends on how you approach and what kind of understanding you have with someone else. So it's really kind of a mix nowadays. Some people prefer, not prefer. So that is how I see about these terms.
You mentioned some of the problems, excuse me, in the United Kingdom, and I would much rather take a South Korean subway or a train than a British one, just in terms of, that's development, isn't it? It's night and day. Before we talk about South Korea's development, one of the things, Sojin, that I have trouble communicating to my South Korean students and to the international students is the situation that South Korea was in, I guess, before the miracle on the Han River, before this development, before the subways and trains and KTXs that we have today. Like, from your understanding in terms of development and aid, where was South Korea? Because we know where it is now, don't we? But like, are you able to give just even a rough idea of what kind of situation it was in the 50s, in the 60s? Or
I was born in late 1970s. So me, myself, how I perceive Korea in 1950s and 60s is basically from the pictures and from the conversation which I have with my parents or my aunts or uncles or even my grandparents. And it's based on that conversation, I have this certain image of the countries that time. In that sense, if we simply approach, if you think of this stereotype image of North Korea nowadays with the buildings which is not marginalized, not Pyongyang, but those in the borderline with China, which for me looks like a little bit between still somewhere from Joseon Dynasty time or even the Japanese colonial time. So we still used to have those kind of housing system. And the road, if we think about, we didn't have this road system of today. It was most of just road, which is really difficult to walk or even ride cars because it's bumpy a lot. Sure. And that kind of reminds me whenever I visit countries like Tanzania. I had my PhD fieldwork in Tanzania for like a year. And I had a chance to go deep in the village where you have to drive more than 4 hours. Then you reach the village, and going into that village, because the road is not modernized road, it's just, as it was from the beginning. And it was really bumpy, and it was really hard for the big cars going smoothly. And if you think about, for example, you are in the Deepin village, and then you all of a sudden became sick, and then you need to get to the hospital. But number one, you don't have any facility to get to the hospital, even though you luckily have a bicycle or motorcycles, then the road condition is not good. And also the telephony or all this online or internet was not there. And on top of that, I have experienced that I was isolated because there were a lot of rain and floods around my village. So I couldn't go out for like a week. No water, because, they were all, and no electricity. So I had to just, be there without light or without water, without food. And it was really an experience. And that kind of houses, families were there in 1950s and 60s, especially, after the Korean War. So that was kind of a very difficult situation, if you think, and all disease, because you can't have a clean water access. So, you suffer from all this disease. And I still remember that when I was in elementary school, it was in 1980s, I see my classmate in front of me, and, the lice, in the hairs were still there. So we had to pick them up. So those kind of situations were there. But if I speak with younger generation nowadays, looking at lice, they haven't even had a look of the lice kind of thing in their life before. And, and also we had to see, these worms in our bodies, all different kinds of, because of the situation. And we had to have kind of a nasty test time. So I still remember, when I was in elementary school, every year you have to take your poop in the little bag and then submit it to the school, and school all collects, send it to the lab of the government, and they test, and then they identify how many students are still having these worms in the body system, and we had to have a tablets to kill them, and we had to have yearly tablets afterwards. So all these kind of things were there already, even in 1980s. And if you imagine in 1950s and 60s, it would have been really, really difficult to see, even imagine the days of we live at the moment. And if I speak with my parents, having a fridge itself, little one, it was really, really hard thing to achieve, because not only the supplies were enough, but also the electricity and, all these expensive gadgets at home. And I remember when my mom was pregnant, they didn't have air conditioning at all at the time. And they had only one fan, but because the electricity cost was really high, but they now had to have the fridge, which is a very little one. And my mom in the summertime used to open the fridge and then put the belly on it to make her baby cool. Not herself, she was still sweaty. Now, all these things, those kind of stories, the stories of 1970s. And if you think how it would have been in 1950s and 60s, so that's how I approach these imaginable times.
South Korea is sometimes, in terms of weather, a difficult place to live in the 21st century, with the heat, the humidity, the cold winters, and how people would have survived that. The belly in the fridge is amazing. First time I've heard it. I'll get in trouble for saying this, but my wife, she still tells stories of having to do like communal exercise in the mornings before school. Like this kind of, it's not that long ago though, is it, Sojin? That's the thing about it.
No, it's not. No, so that then goes to the conversation about 새마을운동, right? the New Village movement created by President Park Chung-hee time when we had a economic kickoff time. And that 새마을운동, if you see the main rationale of the 새마을운동 can be very good. Once you conduct industrialization in the country, you tend to focus on cities, but then the rural places tend to be abandoned easily. So the 새마을운동 was more about the rural development, parallel development from urban and rural. So urban cities, you focus on industrialization, heavy industrialization. At the same time, in the rural places, you impose the 새마을운동, so make people to come all together, work together, and make your village clean. So every morning, like in Islamic countries, you have a mosque, having the music around. That kind of music came out with a song about 새마을운동, every village in 1970s or 60s. Then, people come out and then do some exercise, and then, wiping your neighborhood or make things. And then, you begin your day early, right? So it's about the mentality. And when I was in school, I didn't have 새마을운동 that time because it was 1980s. But like your wife said, what we had to do, all students come to the playground all together, and there's a microphone, a teacher, telling students in lines, if you see this mass movement of China or North Korea, we used to have it. I don't know whether they still have it nowadays because I don't have kids, obviously, but I used to have it when I was a kid, and that was a normal. And every morning we all do the exercise together. And I remember when you had the Asian Game and Olympic Game in 1986 and 1988, we also used to do some military exercises to make our body stronger because of this, Olympic and Asian Games spirits. So more still that time, I see the legacy of this authoritarian approach, military-based, centered mentality. So yeah, those were there in early days. Nowadays, I can't imagine, we have those kind of things. No way.
Can you imagine trying to get your students today or in South Korea, asking them to bring poop into class or to do early morning exercise? The hashtags, the social media would explode. They would go crazy. But I love those stories because Sojin, it makes it real, doesn't it? And I think, therefore, when you hear more about those experiences, you understand how people might have different perspectives on the country, the transformation, when they've inhabited both, let's say, contemporary Korea today and during that development period, because they would have seen these changes. So if we get into this question, then I guess, Sojin, what is it that helps South Korea from going, with Seoul having very little in the way of electricity, running water, having slums and fields, to what it is now? You mentioned at the start people's efforts and a goal. It's a very difficult question, I guess, but how does it achieve that? How does it go from what it was to what it is today? Was it just people's efforts? Were there lots of different factors? How do you try to get that across?
That is a really, really difficult question to answer, because when we talk about the economic development of South Korea as a country, we still have this question about authoritarian dictatorship along with economic development. No other countries experience this. So, for example, we have Africa, Korea Economic Development Ministers Conference every year. And I remember that when I attended that for the first time, the very questions from African leaders were, South Korea used to have dictators. Then, South Korean officials had to correct it as authoritarianism rather than dictators because of this rhetoric and the government and stuff. And they asked whether economic development would have been possible in South Korea without President Park Chung-hee, without dictatorship, without authoritarianism. It's because, we can't say anything in hindsight, history would have been like that,
Sure.
So we can't give a concrete answer about that. One thing for sure is that authoritarianism or dictatorship are not good. You can't just, suppress people like that because of the reason for economic development. But South Koreans had to anyhow experience, because if we think about the way how Park Chung-hee spent his earlier life, he was in Japan and his experience itself was developed in a certain way. And, our view of life is based on how we lived, how we experienced, right? And also before even Park Chung-hee, the Lee Seung-man president was also not 100%, democrat, even though he studied in the US. And also the Korea's modern contemporary history was all of a sudden started from the gap from my point of view. We had still Joseon Dynasty time, and then all of a sudden Japanese occupation was there, and then it was not normal process of a country's development. And all of a sudden, so-called modernized Korea was created with external involvement, US and other countries, right? So I don't know, it's really difficult to say whether South Korea could have seen the different pathway of economic development without those paths. It's really difficult to say, but one thing for sure is that, as I said, the sacrifice of the people, regardless, they really, because they experienced the war, they experienced the colonial government, they knew that these are all the experience which they do not want to hand over to their children. The next generation should deserve better. So in that sense, the efforts and sacrifice were there for sure. And I believe that those kind of mentality kind of helped out well of the speed of economic development.
I've never asked this question before. I don't even know if it's polite, but just listening to you talk, do you think when you mentioned the scars, the trauma of Japanese occupation, colonization, that when you have these dictators or authoritarian presidents, or whichever term is correct, that for some people it was, well, at least it's our dictator. At least it's a Korean one. It's not the United States, it's not Russia, it's not China, it's not Japan anymore. It's our one. Is there an element of that going on, Sojin, or do you think that kind of misses the point?
Not so sure. It's really controversial, I still remember the time when I was in the elementary school, for example, all of a sudden in the afternoon class, we were told not to go out. And then we were all locked within the school because the university students' protest began outside, and all this military with a tear gas came over against students. And my elementary school was next to the university, and two other universities were not far away. So these three university students, they all the time doing this protest together against the government. Then these school kids, the elementary school kids, had to be locked. And, we all suffered because of this tear gas came into the school. And next morning, like the exercise, in the morning, every class take a turn. So one class today go out and then, clean the around the school. Then next day is the next class. So it was our class term. And one of my classmates lost a finger because there was the tear gas which was not blown. But then when he touched it, and then all of a sudden, so he lost his finger. So this kind of experience I still have. Certainly it's not something I want others to experience. And I also used to hear all these nasty, unfair stories from my senior members from the school and from the university. It's something, if you don't experience it, you can't imagine how it would be like. But at the same time, maybe because we really struggled, and then regardless, we really wanted to achieve something and worked hard, then there was this development in the society as well. But really, it's really not easy to clearly visualize.
Do you think those experiences drove you towards the idea of working with development, with working with aid and these kind of things?
No, it's not like that, because in a way, my parents' generation, they are really conservative. If you see the recent presidential election, there's a very clear generation gap to see the candidates. And not only me, many of my friends' parents are that much different in a way, how they think about the government, for example, how they think about Jaebal's and Samsung's. They are the ones who sustained the economy of Korea. And if someone's, so it's like very different generational gap there. And I don't know, if I think for me, it's more like the development was not in my mind that time when I entered into the university. Kind of what I learned from the university was kind of different from what I learned from my high school time in terms of Korean history. So I didn't that time think about this development aid yet. For me, it was not the globalized world yet. So the Korea, so-called globalized Korea, began in late 1990s, and President Kim Il-sung all of a sudden talk about globalization without any clue. So it was not in my mind yet. But for me, the turning point was when I was in third year of my university, I think. That time, what happened in Korea, normally when you could go to pharmacy and ask pharmacists to give you some medicines, and then they could combine different kinds of pills, without prescription. So it's not only over the counter in the tablet boxes, but then they could make their own prescribed pills. But that time, the government imposed a new policy like what you have in the UK, for example, and nowadays. So whenever you want to have certain combined pills, I don't know how to exactly call it in English in a nice way, but without prescription, it was possible. But nowadays, you should have a prescription in order to have certain range of pills from the pharmacy. And those pills you can get from the pharmacy is only over the counter or ready-made, right? So the government made it clear that now pharmacists can't make their own decision what to provide. So they should have prescriptions. People should have prescriptions from the medical doctors in order to have those kind of pills from the pharmacy. So those kind of discussion was there, and we call it medical medicine division. So there were a big protest from the medical school students as well. So students, medical school students could not attend the classes because they were on the protest. So during winter vacation time, they had to catch up their missing classes from those protests. And the university where I came from, the Ewha Women's University, used to go, the medical school students of Ewha Women's University used to go to Cambodia or Nepal as a volunteering medical time every winter. But because these medical students had to attend the missing classes during the winter time, they couldn't go. So for the first time of the university history, they had to select non-medical students for this medical volunteering camp. And mostly they wanted to select students from majored in education sector. So I did my undergraduate for the elementary education. So I applied and I was successful. So I went to Nepal with the medical team. Before then, I had to go to the Iwa hospital in Mokdong to get some trains and the basic things, what to do, kind of things. So with medical doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, and the handful of students, we went to Nepal during winter time. It was first time for me to fly to somewhere else apart from Korea in my life. And imagine, you landed on the airport at nighttime, no electricity, just a cemented ground and building, still with the military guys with long guns. And there's only one big light featuring on the ground where the plane landed. And, it was like kind of in a prison camp, really weird. And then you went into this very poor facility and then come out and all these people, all this different world. And it was really shocking for me. And whilst doing this medical volunteering job was really, really difficult to see people because we easily could fix certain things right away. Some people couldn't do that, and that made the situation worse. And now they have to amputate because it lost the golden time, all these kind of things. And that's how I became so much interested in this development aid, because I learned what is aid there with other medical people from US or other countries. And because they ran out of their medicines and we had to work together all of a sudden, it was not planned. And that's how I learned how other countries work on the so-called development aid game. So that's why I entirely changed my career pathway. As an elementary education university students, when I graduated, I had the teacher's certificate, and I was supposed to had an exam and then becoming elementary school teacher. But just my mind entirely changed because of that experience. So my interest in development aid was not from the economic development of Korea. And as I said, I didn't realize how it could be prestigious situation to be in South Korea before I began to fly and see other countries. And the more realization came through afterwards rather than my early days.
I think that's really interesting how you understand South Korea's position, perhaps relative to other countries. That, when you visit places like Nepal, then it gives you a different understanding of South Korea relative to that. On your work on aid, Sojin, and before I ask this question, I must say I think it's wonderful how you tell these stories, not just through sort of like data and statistics, but like today you're telling it through human experiences and memories and things. I love it. Your academic work does look at a lot of aid and like aid given to South Korea just during its development. So I still want to try to piece out this story. You focus on like American aid to South Korea in one of your pieces, and this is like $2 billion over a 15-year period, very short time, but a large amount of money. How do you understand the role that American financial aid has played in South Korea's economic transformation? Sort of its military is well understood with the war, but that money given to South Korea, what role has that played?
I strongly believe that one country can't help the other country's economic development solely. It should be in solidarity with other countries. But the situation in South Korea was really different because it's geopolitically very important position in that time, even now, ideological war, Cold War period. It has the China, Russia there. So America had to keep this South Korea as a ally of their side and couldn't get this peninsula occupied by so-called the Russia or Soviet Union at that time and China. Still nowadays, the Korea Peninsula works as a buffer zone.
Yep.
That's why China still provides aid to North Korea. It doesn't fully abide by the sanctions because China knows that North Korea should be there. It was not much different in old times. South Korea should have been there for American side. So it was not altruistic reason at all from America to provide aid to South Korea. And that was why a lot of money was put into South Korea. And those money from America was not only bilateral, it was also through the multilateral organizations like UNDP or other multilateral organizations. But the important thing here is that what kind of aid America provided, I would say. For example, at the beginning of development stage, South Korea, as you see, the natural resources is scarce. South Korea doesn't have a lot of natural resources to develop. So it only needed money to import necessary resources. Then in order to do that, the seed money had to be there. Then this kind of aid at that time, financial aid or technical aid, which provides you the skills to develop or skills to work on. So those work really well. It's really based on the textbook. In theory, it says like that. And then for me, South Korean case really worked out well if we think about the theories of development. Then eventually, other countries began to invest, which means loan aid or concessional aid rather than grant aid. So in that sense, the initial American grant aid worked as a seed money. And also it could show other countries that this country is a credential in terms of provide investment. Because, if you don't think that country has ability or capability to return, then, no such country will come back unless it's altruistic. So at the beginning, after the war, it was altruistic from other countries. But then, once it turned into a certain stage, then they more or less think about the diplomatic reasons or commercial reasons when they provide aid. And because of the geopolitical situation of South Korea, America provided a lot of money, and that's how it worked. So I would not say that thankfully to American aid. I would have said that there was a reason from America to provide the aid, and that kind of coincidentally fitted well in the situation of Korea at the time.
So it was, from America's perspective, it was driven by self-interest. It wasn't altruistic, but nevertheless, it did benefit South Korea in receiving that during the time. What about then what happens, Sojin, and I guess this might also be a little bit controversial, but I asked the question respectfully based on your research. What about the grant aid and concessional loans that comes from Japan? Because I think the American financial aid is quite well documented in Korean language press and news. That comes up a lot. I'm quite familiar with it. But the Japanese story, I think, is sometimes perhaps not as widely known. And when your article was pointing at that a little bit, it sort of made me stop and think. What role did Japanese finance and aid play in South Korea's development?
As I said, one country's aid can't play a significant role in a country unless it's really a big push. No such sufficient big push has been done in any other countries. And likewise, Japanese aid, in terms of the amount, did not play significant role. It's all accumulated with other countries' aid, like from Germany or France, World Bank, UNDP, the organizations, or United States. And also, when we define the terms, now we don't call it as an aid or development aid. And the Japanese one, we call it as a compensation against war crime, but it was not from the beginning. Japan reported its aid to South Korea as an ODA, official development assistance, but the budget where it came from was not from the ODA budget. It was from the different budget pocket, and there were long discussion, as I remember, when I still was in aid agency. At the beginning, without consider, we just called it Japanese aid. But all of a sudden, the government made it clear that now there was agreement, or there was the final decision not to call as aid anymore, but it's war compensation, right? So that's why we began to change the terms. So that means it was not from the beginning, it was not agreed as our compensation, but there was some confusion in between. And that became clearer if we see the case of North Korea. When Japan was about to provide aid to North Korea, and North Korea requested aid to Japan, North Korea demanded the same scheme like Japan provided South Korea. And Japan denied to call it war compensation. North Korea demanded it as a war compensation. And Japanese government denied to call it as a war compensation. And if it has too big war compensation, then Japan denied to provide any aid. Then North Korea and Japan kind of discussed, and then, as I remember correctly, was something like economic development fund or aid, something like that, using different terms, right? But then, all of a sudden this abduction and the nuclear happened. So Japan sending nothing to North Korea. But this kind of discussion, conversation, disputes were all there. And I believe that even now, today, the understanding or the official documenting between South Korea and Japan would be different, because even other disputes around Korean Peninsula, if you see the situation, it would not be clearly defined in Japan side in the same way as in South Korea.
I think it demonstrates just how complicated this issue is, because it's not just about giving aid or giving money or support or finance, but it's also related to geopolitics. It's also related to intentions, whether they're altruistic or not. It's related to terminology, how these things are classified. It sounds even more difficult now. If I come back into South Korea rather than the external factors, your work, Sojin, also looks at 5-year plans. So in this economic transformation of South Korea, and I think the first 5-year plan is coming early 60s, like 1962. And again, this might show my ignorance, but when I see 5-year government plans, I start thinking of China and North Korea, and like this is top-down, state-centered economic development. Am I right to associate it with those countries? Do other countries have 5-year, 10-year plans? What role did these 5-year plans play in South Korea's development during this time?
So when we talk about this, we call it as a midterm plan. So midterm plan is normally 5-year, and the long term goes to 10 years. Okay. And in theory, it's really recommended by multilateral organizations like World Bank. So a country should have a national development plan, mostly 5-year to 10 years. Okay. So that time, regardless whether President Park Geun-hye was right person or not from this dictatorship and all this stuff, if we solely focus on the economic development limited, then having 5-year plan that time from the government itself was something really amazing. Because when we provide development aid to other countries, normally they do not have capacity, the government capacity to come up with its own development plan. Because of that, the aid providers cannot hold the ownership of partner countries because they don't have their own plan. And then from the provider's side, from providers' already developed experience, look around and see, oh, for your country, this would have been a good plan to do. So they impose what they think is good, right? That's why we call Bretton Woods system or World Bank neoliberal approach, right? Basically, that provides you that one size fits all approach. No, there is a big tree, and then this famous cartoon made it clearer. So we are today having the exam, and you have animals like elephant, snake, monkey, birds, or fish, and you all have one test exam. There's a big tree. Who comes up to climb up to the tree fast is the one who get the 100 mark. It's not fair, right? And this is like that. So providers seeing the situation of these countries who have different level of development status, but then giving one good, so-called good policy, and they have to abide by, then they provide the aid. It's all because they didn't have their own plan. They didn't have a capacity to come up with their own plan. So that's why nowadays the norm is that the providers help out partner countries' government to think and come up with their own mid-term plan. And by having it, they see their income, the budget, national budget. Normally in countries, they don't have ability to mobilize domestic resources because people can't pay for tax. So the finance gap, in order to, for example, to have the big port for import and export, you need to have a big money, right? But it's not enough from the taxpayers' money. Then that money should be substituted by the external aid, where the aid works. Then you need to know, we have a national plan. For example, the South Korea, the very first highway from Seoul to Busan, that really helps out the industrialization process a lot because the trade and all these things becomes really fast. In order to do that kind of construction, we call it hardware construction, then you need to know it takes how many years, then how much money you need in your budget. So those kind of things all need to be in your national budget for 5-year plan. Then you can tell the providers, oh, for next 5 years, we need this amount of money and we don't have it. We have only this amount. So this much money we expect you guys provide us. So those kind of things. Then the providers, oh, so in your country, your situation is different from my country. Oh, I can see that your country have a lot of more mountains. So you can't have this kind of road, but then that kind of road need to be there and need to be different approach. So this is why this so-called 5-year midterm plan is really important. So it could be seen as a government-centered. Of course, it is government-centered, but it's how you implement it is more important. So the South Korea, the so-called 4 tigers in East Asia, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, all we call them as a developmental states. And developmental states has this very strong feature, the central government's national plan. And that really worked out well. So again, it doesn't happen in all the cases, even though other countries have this national plan imposed by the central government. We don't see achievement there. It's because the implement process is different. So it's more about, rather than having government-centered imposed top-down approach or not, it's more about then how you can facilitate and implement it. That's how at least see.
So South Korea, it did have the plans and it did have these midterm things, and it wanted that Seoul to Busan expressway, and it had to go through so many mountains, I remember reading, to get there. So then it does that. It has the plans. It implements the plans. Then how much, Sojin, does South Korean culture play a role in this? Does it play any role? I mean, you mentioned the 4 Asian tigers. So I guess this is sometimes a controversial question. I think some people love this explanation. Some people hate it. But, in South Korea, there is that there are Confucian hierarchical relationships, and that who you went to school with and where you're from and your hometown, there are bonds. Everybody has bonds, right? It's natural. But how much of a role do you think that culture played alongside the plans and alongside the aid?
my own experience is very limited as well. So I can't tell or compare with other cultures. But once I lived in this country, in the UK, I realized that in the UK also you have those nepotism a lot, right?
Yeah.
It's everywhere. So I can't say that that is something bad or good because it's human nature, as I see, it's everywhere. But the case of South Korea is because of the culture of economic development was so fast. There's a certain things which represent South Korean culture in a way. For example, the competitiveness is just too much. When I grew up, all the time, from the top, whenever you have exam, which rank you've won, that's the only thing your parents would have focused. But nowadays it's a bit different because now the parents know that having talent in some way can make your children different. For example, singing better or dancing better or even golf, all these things, sports. But when I grew up, these kind of sport, music, arts, they were not important at all. Most important thing is, having good exam on the paper. They're all the time being compared was something, and you have to be good all the time.
Right.
And that mentality, I grew up in that culture. So it still is here. So whenever I work here in the UK at the moment, automatically I see everybody as my competitors. I can't help. But people in the UK, they don't have it. No, they have more luxury of peace in mind, I call it. So this kind of a competitiveness is there as a culture, and that works in a good way to bring up synergy amongst colleagues, but at the same time, it ruins because you all the time have to compete, right? So that is one culture grew up with economic development in Korea. And as we all know, the education fever and good level of education. I was really shocked when I first came here in the UK, only about less than 30% of population goes to university. And many of our university students, they are first generation. So here, first generation, most of Koreans would not know. So in your family, you are the first one who have education in the university level, at the university level. So most of our students are first generation, and because of that, they don't know what to do after graduation. Right. With university degree, easily end up at the Starbucks working as a part-time server kind of thing. It was really shocking for me because in Korea, most of people go to university or college, and and more and more going to having MA or PhD degrees, but they're still being jobless, right?
Yeah.
But countries like in the UK, I, as an academic, who spent a lot of time and spent a lot of money, finance on my education, ended up with the salary which is at the bottom level of the society. And people who has skills, who didn't have a education at the university, but having a skill like, becoming joiner or becoming like plumber, they earn a lot better. And then they enjoy their life, every summertime they go to Spain, they have their own houses there and enjoy the sun. So this is very different culture from my perspectives, compared to this education and competitiveness. It's unnecessary torture mentally, but here it's very different. And my students at the university, they don't much care about their grades. Well, they care about grades, but not at the same level as Korean students, because they know that once they have the degree, then they try the work which they want to do. But from Korea, your future work will depend on which grade you've earned, right? So that is a really different culture in terms of the economic development process and pathway.
That's a really nice way of looking at it, rather than focusing on, let's say, the nepotism or things, which is everywhere. You look at the Eton and our prime ministers and such forth in the UK, right? And Russian peerages being bought in the House of Lords and things like that. It's well documented. But in terms of the attitudes towards education and social advancement, they are different. You know, I think you're absolutely correct to point it out. And when you mentioned joiners, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, right, lackeys, they also have a fair amount of social, like cultural capital. Whereas in South Korea, to not be at university or to not be in those fields, it's not just the money, I think, Sojin, sometimes. It's rather the I don't know, whether it's bonbun or nunchi, but they're looked down upon a little bit more, I think, aren't they?
Yeah, it's really different. It's like, because I'm South Korean, 100% South Korean, so I still can't get out of my own culture, and I call it my own culture. So, for example, my colleague who has a higher level of education, but then dating with someone without university level education. In Korea, it's a taboo. You can't tell about it to your friends, right?
Right.
But here, it's not. No, just nobody cares, oh, how's the person like, and then we just have a pop time together and, get to know each other together and have decent conversation. Because the conversation is not only from the education, but they tend to listen to radio, and the radio feed the information into people. And we can have decent conversation about the politics and all these things. But in South Korea, I can't imagine, you go to the pub and then meeting someone being plumber and having talk about politics at the set level. No, it's really different. So this, I call it a different culture.
I think the pub culture is completely different, because in England you go to a pub and you just talk to random people. A lot of the time you're standing up, actually. I think just the logistics, you're standing up, you've got a pint in your hand, there's no anju. But in South Korea, you're sat at a table, aren't you? And you have your little bell. So just the logistics. We're recording this, Sojin, on a Sunday. And when we arranged it on a Sunday, and I said, let's do it Sunday, you said to me, David, you're very South Korean now. You want to work on a Sunday.
Yeah.
Here we are. Let's just try to get through this aid bit a little bit more. When South Korea changes from a recipient country, Sojin, to I'll get these words wrong, but to a donor country. So it's a partner, but its role in that partnership changes. Rather than receiving aid and money, it starts doing that, and it joins the OECD in 1996. These are big steps, I think. How meaningful are they, do you think? And do they have a big fanfare amongst normal people, or is it only academics and sort of economists that look at South Korea now donating and joining the OECD? How does that transformation work?
So here, this is really my personal observation and opinion. Good. And based on anecdotal observation, which I heard from my senior colleagues. I have no clear evidence whether it was really like that or not. But as I heard anecdotally, when South Korea joined OECD in 1990s, the President Kim Yong-sam all of a sudden began to talk about globalization. His cabinet members didn't know what globalization meant. President Kim Yong-sam met somewhere outside and heard globalization, and that was the keyword in my term. So that's how, and then boosted the way towards OECD. For me personally, I think it was a bit hurrying up process. As an OECD member, the students, for example, at university, they can't apply for many different kinds of scholarship opportunities, because most of the scholarship opportunities goes to non-OECD member countries. Because OECD countries tend to be categorized as high-income rich countries. So those scholarships tend to go to relatively poorer country students to give more opportunities for them to study. So still there are many students who need scholarships in South Korea, because South Korea culture is not donation culture, not like here. So students do not see many scholarship opportunities, and abroad, they could have had more opportunities with their education level, but because they are OECD members, they can't even apply for. So these kind of things. Well, for now, for sure, South Korea is a very high-income country. But if you think about what happened in 1990s, late 1990s, Asian financial crisis, you know, my family also had a lot of impact. My dad my dad also had to lose his job, and my family suffered a lot. It's because the economy was not stable enough to be the high-income country yet. It was not mature enough. So the income level went into the middle income. Then what we call now is middle income trap. Fortunately, South Korea overcame the middle income trap and became high income country. But not many countries could overcome, like many of the Latin American countries. Once they enjoyed their economic development, they now are stuck, right?
Yeah.
So becoming OECD member was a bit of a hurry, but now, no doubt, you know, and also is clearly a donor country. And about this fanfare or this, you know, celebration, in the news, you know, there were things, oh, this is something enormous, this is something important, this is something incredible that South Korea, who was a fragile state to become the OECD member country, was there. But from daily life, people didn't know why it was so important. What does that mean, you know? We are still struggling, and then we still want to achieve them. All of a sudden, not long after, you know, we had an Asian financial crisis. So it was not like people enjoyed the moment of becoming OECD members. You know, in theory, on paper, we know that it's something good, but in real life, nothing much. No, it's not much different, right? So that's what happened, and that's how I see the situation.
Whenever I read about Kim Young-sam, it's always 세계화. It's always that word that comes up. Now it's globalization is the one that I keep seeing that we have to get to terms with. You've mentioned the Asian financial crisis, or the IMF, a few times here, Sojin. And when you were talking about aid development, you were suggesting that if there's a plan and there's the seed money, then countries or states can do it themselves because they know their environment rather than these externally imposed neoliberal ideas. I think you mentioned like the World Bank. So when I think about the Asian financial crisis or the IMF crisis in South Korea, 1997, 1998, some people see that as like the beginning of the end. Like that was the introduction of neoliberalism, and it was like, now it's gone terrible. Other people see that as like the savior, and we came out through it. So it divides opinion. Do you have a take on that, whether that was a positive thing, having had now 20 years hindsight?
Personally, I'm not a fan of Washington consensus. So this World Bank, IMF, their policy, structuralism, the neoliberal based, we call it Washington consensus Bretton Woods system. I'm not a fan of them because they tend to impose one policy, as I said, the one size, still they are within, but you know, it's really different to change the organizational culture as well. So they are still in there. And also in South Korea, the IMF loan was there. And because of that, as a condition, there were structural changes in South Korean economic system. For example, you know, this octopus-like big giant Jabal companies had to restructure and giving up certain part, and like Daewoo, a car manufacturing company, had to be merged by the American car manufacturer. All these things. It's just. I don't know. So once you provide the loans, you know, you have full right to tell recipient what to do. But by doing so, from the surface, it looked like it works well because the money came in, and you know, the manufacturing, the system or the Jabal system slightly changed it. But at the same time, many of ordinary, subordinary companies, the outsourced companies and their family members had to suffer a lot, and there were so many unfortunate cases. So morally think, I don't think Washington consensus see the macro level, micro level, but only focus on the macro level. And that's why I don't agree with Washington consensus. But yeah, because I'm not the pure economist, so I don't see any better solution. So yeah, I just can't say, oh, I don't like, and that's it. I know that I can't say that, but at the same time, yeah, it's really difficult to provide any alternatives, I know. So yeah, I don't know whether one is correct or the other is not, but still just imposing without change, imposing one policy as a sound policy in multiple countries, I do not think that is right approach to do.
And again, from an economic perspective or a theory perspective or this Washington consensus, sometimes it doesn't account for the lives of people. And like you mentioned, your father losing his job and everything like that, I think that's definitely going to affect it. So in that sense, Sojin, now South Korea being sort of this, it donates. I read recently that President Moon ordered the Ministry of Justice to donate 10 million in aid to Ukraine and things like this. It does play a role now, I think, South Korea. What role it plays can be debated, but now it does give aid and it provides humanitarian things, and that's really good. Sometimes, however, I see domestically in the lives of some people, some Koreans, that they're reluctant, whether it's with refugees or the building of mosques and these kind of things. And again, that happens everywhere as well. Let's be clear about that, from the home of Brexit. But how much of, when we talk about this aid and changing hands, what I'm trying to ask is how much is based on purely giving stuff and how much is based on attitudes and empathy? So how much is economic and how much is psychological or humane? I'm trying to ask here.
So the conversation can be really complex or very simple. If we think about the accountability of the government, government is accountable for the taxpayers, because the aid money is taxpayers' money, right?
Yep.
So when government provide aid, it can't be 100% away from taxpayers' benefits. Then it will be questioned, well, you are using my money to certain countries, and what is my benefit, right? That is the most of the situations. And that's why China, for example, cannot reveal its aid money to its own population, because many of population are still suffering a lot in China, but then the government can't reveal, oh, we have this money, but then we don't want to give this to you for your better life, but then we are giving this to other countries because we want to have a diplomatic relations with those countries, right? Sometimes it's not persuasive.
Yeah.
But the countries like South Korea, which is a democratic country, has to open this data. And that's why the South Korean government sometimes really struggle in order to justify to provide a certain amount of money to certain countries. Not much different in other countries. For example, the UK, US, in the document, clearly saying that the development aid is provided based on the national interest. And if you see the ODA chart of Japan, Japan clearly says that we are providing, for example, aid money to Malaysia in order to make their law system becoming same as our system, so that our business people can have a more trade with Malaysia, right? So that is clearly stated. So in that sense, even the government development aid doesn't work truly altruistic. Some of the Northern European countries are known to be more altruistic than other countries, but nowadays in this populist society, more and more, the development aid has become based on the natural interest. And for countries like Indonesia, Cambodia, those who are relatively lower level in terms of providing aid, they use aid money for their diplomatic footprints. It's really common practice. And that is one level we understand. And if we think domestically, how people conceive using this aid, and for example, not only providing aid to other countries, but then my tax pay used for these refugees within the country, having people here in this country and then spend it. Why? That is the very first question. Because if you think, we still have slums in main big cities. In Seoul, if you go, there's slums and there are elderly people who just be there by themselves.
Yeah.
There are kids or there are orphans, and the government can't take care of them, but then want to use this taxpayers' money for aliens, so-called, right? It's also, I can see that is the cultural dynamics there. Because South Korea itself started from very fragile status, and South Koreans have not been refugees themselves for at a certain level like other countries like Syria or now Ukraine. We don't see many refugees around. For example, Italy or UK, every day refugees are coming from nowhere, right? China from North Korea, but South Korea, not much. And if you think about how South Koreans perceive about North Korean defectors, you know, even though the government say that North Korea is part of South Korea, but then for many of South Koreans, North Koreans are strangers. Right? Even the people who used to live together, still some of our people's families are there, and we share the same language, same culture, same history. They are strangers. And because of that, if we think it's really not easy issue to address in South Korean society, it's still premature. And we really need to change people's mindset, but it will take quite a long time to greet refugees and justify why we want to have refugees in South Korea. So it will not be easy to maybe, you know, if the education system turns it into the more preferred way for this culture from the elementary school level, then the new generation may perceive it differently. But even for my generation, who's in now 40s, we've never heard of the word or met refugees in our life, and all of a sudden refugees are there, and then it's something really new, and that would take some time. And most of the policymakers or the people who can make big voices in society are in this generation now. So if they don't change their mindset, you know, it won't be easy to accept and proceed it in a different way. It's pity, but yeah, that's the reality.
And maybe the reality is that long-term change that will take place through education, perhaps through ideas and through new generations. I want to get to North Korea because you just mentioned sort of the people that come here from North Korea, and you've done a lot of work on North Korea. But before that, when you were talking about aid and donations being labeled as in the national interest, so I guess this is kind of, I don't know, a philosophical question. I don't know if it's possible to answer. I remember reading like Derrida at university, that I think it was Derrida with the gift, the argument being that it's impossible to give a gift. You're always giving it with the assumption that you will receive benefits, either material or cultural capital, this kind of thing. Sojin, is it possible to be altruistic and give gifts without the assumption that you'll receive something in return?
It really depends on the culture where you grew up. For example, in Northern European countries, where you pay about more than 50% of your income as a tax. And, you know, that is something natural. And you just take it as natural because it's your society. And having this magical system for free, everybody. And, you know, if once you become elderly, then, you know, you can benefit from your tax because everybody does.
Right.
But apart from those certain countries, then the other countries, it's really different situation. And being altruistic is, for example, when I was asked to provide justification why South Korea, that time even South Korea was not clearly defined as a middle power country. South Korea, who has just become a donor country, has to provide aid to the other country, whilst it itself is not still traditionally high income or still have a lot of people around and having issues with North Korea, right? And one of the justifications commonly used was the globalized world. You see, the MERS, COVID-19, SARS, Ebola. So you have your neighboring countries. Nowadays, it's not even neighboring countries. MERS from Saudi Arabia, Ebola is from African countries, COVID-19 is everywhere. If you do not make those people vaccinated, for example, then you will eventually be affected anyhow, even though you are vaccinated, right? It will continue. So that is why, one of the reasons, if you think in the health sector, you provide them to have health system, the medical system, universal health access, vaccination facility, ability, capability, and people get vaccinated with clean environment. All these things are now accumulating. Then that's why you provide aid for them to be better, so that you don't be affected.
So it's still self-interest.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Yes. So even though in this globalized world, that could be a very good justification, but it's embedded there, still it's good for you. That's why you have to provide aid, right? Otherwise you will be badly affected. So that kind of a mentality. But interestingly, when we say that, people nod, and they tend to think that's altruistic. It's really interesting. So it's really morally, ethically difficult 200% clear to be clear that we provide aid because we should be altruistic. It's really not persuasive. And if you see the government's approach, also there are many reasons because of the colonial ties, commercial reasons like Japan or US, national interest, all these things. That I think is something we should take on with.
You mentioned I'm wondering now whether we can be altruistic without, religions or grand narratives, whether we need them. You mentioned Northern European countries. I think you perhaps referencing Scandinavia, high tax and things like this. Where would you, and again, this might be a silly question, but where would you position South Korea's altruism? The reason I ask this, Sojin, is from personal experience in the United Kingdom. When I walking down the street, I would often throw money to homeless, not throw money. I would put my hand in my pocket and I would buy a big issue, or I'd put some money in a hat or things like this. I don't think I was ever doing it about receiving future benefit. It might just be a social habit, right? To put some coins in there. That doesn't really take place on a day-to-day level in South Korea. You don't see that level of homelessness in public. And when you do, I don't see people sort of giving the money there. It might manifest other ways. I'm not saying South Korean people aren't altruistic, but I'm asking you, where would you perhaps evaluate its level of altruism compared to the Scandinavian countries that you said was quite high?
I can't give a comparison here, but because I thought about this quite for a long time. It's more about trust. And again, the culture of trust. Oftentimes, even when I donated myself in Korea, even my friends and my colleagues tend to say, why? You never know where they use those money, right? Here in the UK, you donate and then it's clear where, and then you trust them. You don't even want to see their, a balance sheet, and it's clear. But in Korea, it's really not everybody, but most of people really being doubtful. Why? Where? Is it going to be really to those people in need? And for the street so-called beggars, right? It's pretty much known as that they are based on the gangster group. So they tend to be blind people, they tend to be disabled, then, the money goes to those gangs behind. It's not going to those people. In a way, it's not. So for example, when I tip in the UK, I always ask the servers, do you have this one for you, or is your owner who takes it? And if they say it's my owner, I don't give. If they say it's us, then I give, right? I think it's pretty much maybe from my own culture from South Korea, because I don't trust where this money goes, without any tails afterwards. So that can be one thing why people hesitate rather than being altruistic or not. Because, people all have a sympathy and empathy, and they had their own difficult times, and they know how it be like, and they must have known the reason why we need to be altruistic. It's not because they don't know, it's because they don't trust the system, right? And we, as a South Korean, also saw a lot of corruption still going on. I remember that, because when I used to work for the aid agency, I had to have education training sessions for the officials from other countries. And one Colombian government official was in the classroom, and I was teaching about South Korea's development. And she, in the break time, asked, saying that, I so envy you because your government is not corrupted at all. My government is all corrupted, everywhere is corruption. I was like, who told you the South Korean government is not corrupt? And, that kind of, right? And the corruption and the experience of people, and even for the presidential election, this negative news coming out, who's more corrupted kind of competition. So that culture kind of makes people not to trust the system. And especially for NGOs, which was not there, the civil society, because my recent, I'm writing a book on North Korea, and I'm pretty much interested in civil society role, and I'm really into it now. And looking at how South Korea developed as a civil society, it was a long way, and it was not the culture of South Korea as well. So when people see the NGOs, it's more about the propaganda protest group against the government. It's political group against the government. It's their norm for ordinary people, which is not always the case, right? Those kind of culture and not trust the system, for me, looks like make people hesitate to donate. Here, whenever people donate something, they don't question it. They fully believe that those money go to people who need those money, right? And some people don't give coins to the homeless people. It's not because they don't trust or think that kind of gangsters behind of the scene. It's because they think those people would buy drugs or cigarettes with those coins rather than buy food, which is really necessary for them. So that's why, for example, when I learned that, I now tend to buy during winter time, for example, if it's winter, I tend to buy hot coffee with a bread and give them the food itself rather than giving them the coins, right? So this, I think, is different. And if I put it in your previous question about the culture, and this is also one side of the culture difference and why people perceive it differently.
I love the idea of trust being important in it, and trust being based on the social day-to-day experiences that goes on around you, and so it's not so much innate or human nature. It's not drilled into us as being this or that, but it's based on the lives that we live and the environment that we come from, and therefore we can make a better environment, make better people. Perhaps that would be the goal. You mentioned civil society in relation to North Korea, so that's a great jumping point to look at your work on North Korea. But before that, what is civil society? I hear it a lot. I kind of know, but it's one of those things where I hope a student never asks me, because it's like, okay, so I get to ask you, Sojin, what's civil society?
That is one thing I actually began to write a chapter from yesterday.
Excellent, good timing.
Beginning from what is civil society? The simple answer is that there's no such concrete definition of civil society yet.
Okay.
Well, it evolved based on the historical situation and how to see the civil society. But in contemporary era, from my point of view, it could be seen as either the society, civil society, which has a sphere of people. People's communication should be there. It doesn't necessarily need to be political, but that is the group of people who has their own voice. It does not need to be organization. it doesn't need to be association, but it could be sphere of the civil society. So it's not like a civilized or citizenship. It's more about the group of people who communicate about certain common interest. So that's how I see it. But I am still in the process, as well. The books I am reading at the moment, these all provide the definitions of a civil society. And it's really a long story, as a matter of fact. I was really surprised to see how to define civil society, because it's apparently different from NGOs or CSOs. Civil society itself is larger concept, and it really depends on how you define. For example, I'm more interested in how Eastern Bloc European countries, when they transformed from the Soviet to the democratic countries, what was the civil society roles? I don't necessarily look at the NGOs groups, but how group of people played their role. And one of the scholars called Purdue defined it as the civil society was a cradle for democracy in the Eastern European countries, which I agree. And I see the civil society also in the same concept that is a cradle of certain changes, right? So that's how I see. And I, in my book, define that civil society would be the cradle for the changes in North Korea.
So I guess that if there is change in North Korea, maybe civil society will play a role like in the Eastern Bloc. So what is, if I could just ask you this very broad question to start, Sojin, what is North Korea to you? Is it part of sort of your divided homeland? Are they your brothers or your sisters? Is it a revolutionary bulwark against capitalism? Is it a nuclear threat? What is North Korea in broad terms to you, Sojin?
It's really, really difficult because, to be honest, before I came here in the UK, honestly, I was not highly interested in North Korea because I was so into development aid to other countries, and unconsciously, North Korea was part of my country. That's why I didn't see it as a foreign country, and that's why I didn't categorize North Korea as a country for my aid goes to, right?
Right.
And all began when I joined here in the UK in Korean studies and the North Korea, all these issues. One of my family members, the uncle-in-law, his family has a root in North Korea. So I used to hear what he heard from his mom and his grandparents about the time when there was invasion from North and when they had to escape, right? But even when I hear those stories, it's not my immediate family story. Right. It's just, one of my neighbors' story, and I don't quite categorize North Korea as a other country, but not as my family. It's just one of the country. But another thing, intuitively, I thought North Koreans are Koreans. And, we, before the Korean War, we were just the same country. And I could have traveled up north if it was not divided. Whenever I meet defectors, the way how I share the conversation, the politeness, the language, certain aspects of understanding, same. But certain things which I have to be careful and sensitive whenever I speak. And sometimes certain things which we accept easily as South Koreans among ourselves, really becoming trigger point for North Koreans. So this kind of things really made me puzzled one day. Oh, are they Koreans or are they someone different? Or it's just very difficult for me. Still, I can't quite process how I have to conceive North Koreans, right? But I believe that it would be really different between generations in South Korea. The generations like my parents who have families my parents' generation, some of them have their still families in North Korea, can be more close. For generation like my younger generations, like my children's generations, your children's generation, can be totally different country. Could be really different. So yeah, it's really difficult question for South Koreans, not all, of course, but then to answer what is North Korea to you, because it's really not simple and easy question to answer.
I agree, it's not easy at all to answer. Do you have many interactions with North Koreans? I know sort of New Malden is one of the places, and there is a fairly reasonably sized, I think, North Korean population in the United Kingdom, particularly around London. Do you have many interactions with them, or is it more infrequent and sporadic?
No, I tend to limit my interaction with the North Korean defectors because they know that I'm working on North Korea. So they tend to see me as the someone who approached them for interviews, right? Because of that, the relationship is really stiff and the conversation is really limited. It's not like a friendship or colleagueship. It's more about official work relationship. And because of that, I don't communicate with them a lot. But in a way, I have one person who I not often, but more meeting more often than others. But then I limit my conversation about North and South issues intentionally, because that makes the conversation really awkward and then very just, repeated way, So that is something, if I was not the academic here working on North Korea, maybe it could have been different. But because they know that I'm working on North Korea, it's really not natural to speak with them for me. So that's why I don't see them oftentimes.
I think that's what I recently spoke to Lee So-hyun, who lived in North Korea till 2014, and I made a point of not asking about political issues and things like that, just to try to get on that level with her. So then, respectfully, of course, Sojin, how do you stay up to date with information about North Korea? I know it's perhaps COVID changes things, and these days we have more access, I think, than ever before, notwithstanding COVID. But how do you stay up to date with it? How do you learn about it?
So the data I see is mostly related to my research, and I don't do my own interviews with the defectors, because most of the interviews pretty much done with academics, and they all have overlapping interviewees. Yeah. And it's really rhetoric nowadays. And because of that reason, I tend to use the second-hand data which others interviewed or others processed, and triangulate with non-academic sources. At the same time, I know that there are lots of YouTube channels updated by the defectors, but whenever they say, "Oh, today I heard this story from North Korea that we have changes like that," always I'm questioning, where did you have this information? How? Because I remember when they during the COVID-19 lockdown in the UK, there was like 3 to 4 months time when Kim Jong-un didn't appear to the public sphere at all. Then that time in Korea, the Taeyong and the other defector, the two politicians who became politicians from North Korea, they clearly said that my source in North Korea said Kim Jong-un was dead. Yeah. But it was not true. Right. Who's your source in North Korea? And even though you have a source in North Korea, how reliable that source is? No, for example, I'm in the UK and someone from South Korea asked me about UK. I tell them no, the news based on what I know. Then it could be true, it could be not true. I also have my limitation of data access, right? So I tell my South Korean friends, "Oh, I heard this today," then it was like that. And it turned out to be that it was not true afterwards sometimes. So because of this process of information, I do not take so-called up-to-date information from the verbal process. Oh, I heard it from, unless they tell me where it is clearly from. And even though it is clearly from someone in North Korea, we don't know how the person achieved this data, right? It's from just, someone else's, you just heard it from your neighbor, which is not quite true.
Right.
So this is why I don't 100% take the information as true at the moment. And at the same time, it's a frustration for me because of this huge limit of the validity of data.
Yeah, that does make it difficult. I like your approach to it, though. So we spoke, Sojin, about how South Korea really did develop in terms of the aid and the plans and the 5 years, the efforts, the sacrifices. And then North Korea, if you look at photos from 1953, like Pyongyang was rubble. And if you look today, you can see it and go, well, it looks all right. You see some pictures of the skyline and the subway. What do you make of North Korea's transformation economically?
So I read some aid workers from, for example, UN bodies telling that the claim that North Korea is fragile or the development is really poor is false, because I saw a lot of difference and huge development, right? Then I see where that person visited. If it's only Pyongyang, Pyongyang's different country. Pyongyang's not North Korea. Pyongyang's just a castle, kingdom of the palace, right? And if I ask others whether they really actually visited local places, not many. And even those who visited Pyongyang, they have a certain district to visit. But recently I heard from someone else who visited the other part of the Pyongyang saying that, those apartments you see from distance looks very high, these skylines, they don't have windows. It's just open place. So whenever in the winter time, the severe wind comes, they have to come up with their own certain measures to block the wind. Because if you see the South Korea, the apartments, they have windows and balconies and to protect. North Korea just building, no windows. So it's more about to see details rather than, and the concrete, the quality, right? Obviously, it looks better than before from outside to see those apartments, the science street, or these high buildings, and looks like, even recently tested the satellite, technology can develop, because people work there. But if you think about the quality and also outside of Pyongyang, it's a totally different story. And also the borderlines with China or non-borderline areas. So that is how I see. But again, because as a South Korean, I have never been to North Korea, and I can only imagine from those footages, right? And I tend to compare it with the places where I visited in other countries, how the houses, ordinary houses look like, how the roof was done, how the street quality is like. So based on that, I tend to examine the level of the economy. But even for the house consensus, the consensus and the economic report, we don't know how exactly it works, because, for example, the Tanzanian government once announced that, we reached the primary elementary education enrollment 100% as targeted by the MDG. But then the Swedish NGO revealed that it's not correct because the consensus was not done correctly. And even Tanzanian government doesn't know certain villages situation. They don't know how many children were born and how they can include them into the data, right? This we call statistics capacity. And in North Korea, well, they have surveillance system. So maybe that could be more correct to see the situation. But in terms of the report, how correct they reveal and report, we don't know. And the economy situation, we use mirror data. only nowadays, which means, collecting data from trade partners of North Korea, from China, from Korea. And we don't know how correct those data is as well. So it's really puzzled the situation. But regardless, many scholars tried hard to get and triangulate and try to have a certain. So it's more or less like we see the trends rather than see the correctness. And if you see the trend, trade goes up apart from this COVID border closure time. It looks like they tend to have more buildings inside, but still we don't know how that affects and made our ordinary people's life better.
Right.
So that is the situation whenever I think of the economic development of North Korea.
Pyongyang as a castle is something that I've given to my students before, that kind of like fiefdom. And if you're inside the walls and the distribution system, then you're good. The further away from the center of physical power, the harder it is. This might be a very political question, and you don't have to answer it if you do not wish, Sojin. Would you go to North Korea if the situation arose? You said that you can't go, being South Korean. If you were able to, would you?
Yeah, if I were allowed, I should. I prefer to have a field work, and in order to do research, it gives a lot better quality of result of findings. And as a person who now working with North Korea, I should. That is what I think. But only when the situation allows. For example, I remember that because I did my internship at the United Nations in 2004. Yeah, 2004. Oh my gosh, a long time ago. And in New York, we have North Korea's mission to United Nations.
Yep.
So the one Swedish intern organized the visit to North Korea mission there, and the North Korea mission told the interns, we need to see the questions which you want to ask, and then you will be allowed to ask questions only you are allowed to, right? And I was so excited to see North Koreans, because I heard that there are many North Koreans in New York, but then you don't know who's who, right? Then I received a call from South Korean embassy saying that it's up to you, it's your liberty to visit North Korea mission or not. But bear in mind, we have the law, national security law. Then it does not mean that you'll be jailed. It's not like that. But there may be follow-up sessions from the government, what you did and who you met. And as a young person who's in university, level yet, I want you to think carefully. That was what I heard. Wow. So I ended up not going there, because that kind of sounded like very risky, for the person who's in early 20s, that kind of call really made me worried. So I didn't go there. But I know that I have a friend who who was studying in Spain that time. And then she visited North Korea as a South Korean, as a part of an NGO group. But no, nothing happened. She doesn't have follow-up sessions. Well, we never know, secretly who, and now she's working in the international organizations and still talk to me about what was like a long time back. So it's really like you don't know how much government will be interested or not as well. So it's just people sometimes make it like bigger than the actual situation. But still, I don't know if the situation allows, then I still believe that I should go and see how it is like. I know that some of the colleagues who I used to work in the Exim Bank, they visited North Korea as a work, because they had to deliver the rice and all this stuff to North Korea. So they was in the ship, and then they went up there to the port, and they had to wait for the clearance, and then they landed, but then very limited contact, right? So those kind of like based on the work, you can visit, but as an ordinary person, apart from like maybe Kumgang Mountain tour regimes, then, well, I don't think I go there as a tourist, but then I want to go there to see the real situation. But really, I'm not so sure whether I can have time to be there in that sense, apart from the tourists. Yeah, it's a pity, but yeah, if situation becomes better and I'm allowed, no, for sure I will go and see the situation and, you know, compare to my data I have on paper and also the actual situation as observation.
It would be good maybe to spend a week in a North Korean house with no electricity or water like you did in Tanzania or something, and then compare it, because that's how you learn, and that's how you get it through that field work. It's fascinating to hear about these phone calls that you might have had if you went to that mission, especially you said that was 2004, because that was a pretty liberal period in Nambook Gwanggae, or inter-Korean relations. In your work, Sojin, that you've done previously, I've seen you rally against the idea of sanctions. So there was a peace forum last year where you were speaking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I was understanding it, you said that sanctions do not work. And they, specifically with North Korea. So we've spoken about aid and giving things, but sanctions, they, in my naive brain, seem the opposite. It's not just not giving, it's not doing nothing, but it's financially punitive measures. And you've spoken out against these towards North Korea. So why do you think they don't work, or why are you against them? Is it an economic, is it a political, is it a moral position?
So sanctions, you need to, when we say sanctions work or not, you need to see the purpose of sanctions, why you impose sanctions. And the reason why we are imposing sanctions on North Korea is denuclearize. But more and more, it's so convincing that North Korea is de facto nuclear state already. And it's really, North Korea, we do not abandon, we do not give it up. And by imposing the sanctions, since 2006, for less about 2 decades, it's more about ordinary people who are suffering more than the regime itself. We need to separate the regime and the people. The adverse effect of sanctions goes to people. It harms the people rather than the regime. In that sense, I don't think sanctions working. For example, the recent situation with Ukraine and Russia. Russia has a lot of international trade partners, and then, you know, it provides gas and it makes money from all these sorts of, and then inside of Russia, there are many people who need the trades. For example, all these Microsoft, even Samsung, the H&M, all these, you know, suppliers, they cut the trade. Then people inside, they see, oh, this is uncomfortable. It's not like we can't live without them, but it's uncomfortable, right? And the Russian government can't make money from this trade. And the oligarchs, you know, they have no access to their finance now. These kind of countries who have a lot of traders, so that the effect of sanctions can become bigger, then more people who can think and go have the ability to protest against government being affected by the sanctions, then it may work. But in North Korea, number one, it doesn't have many international trade partners. It relied on the China, and China doesn't abide by sanctions. And the dependence on China will become even larger. And North Korea, in that sense, does not affect by the international sanctions that much, because it doesn't have many things to lose anyway from the sanctions, right? But the people, again, my argument for the civil society, they don't have a capacity to protest against the government. So even though there's a sanctions, they don't realize it's because of the sanctions. And also the inside of propaganda, you know, never say that we are being sanctioned and that's why you are suffering, right? But Russians, for example, they know exactly that, you know, it's because of the sanctions, the government did misbehaved, and that's why government made our situation in my life becoming worse and worse. I don't have cash access to the bank, so no, that's why, and I know the government decision was wrong, right? Then they have ability to process and ability to decide whether the situation is right or not, and they have ability and capacity to go against the government. So it's inside and outside. squeeze into the government, and sanction can work in that way. But North Korean case, it doesn't have that system. That's why sanctions on North Korea don't work. So that's why I argue that we need to think of something differently, because North Korea is not like other countries. Right. It's a unique situation.
Does aid work? So if sanctions negatively affect the people because there's not that transparency, there's not that civil society, there's not that access to information, people aren't aware of the reality of sanctions. So in that sense, that is aid also useless? I'm not saying it's useless, but does aid then suffer from the same problem? Because if you give it and it gets dispersed through the elite in like this kleptomaniac way without going to the people, is aid also futile in that sense? Or
so I indeed discussed it in my current book, the book which I just finished the chapter about the aid, and its role is really complicated. So you need to see different kinds of aid. And to make a long story short here, I more focused on the human engagement through the aid channel. For example, when the aid was provided after the 1990s, the floods and Arduous March, North Korean government prohibited any aid workers who spoke in Korean, because the government knew that the external people who came to the North Korea meet the ordinary people, then can provide the outside information, right? Yeah. Likewise, currently the K-pop, K-culture, K-drama is huge in North Korea. When you think about the Iron Curtain, in Eastern European countries' time, they smuggled videotape, cassette tape with the Hollywood movies and stuff, which were in English, even though they were not speaking in English, but then they were speaking in Russian. But it still affected their cultural change. Now in North Korea, same language is even easier. SD card, USB, it's not even DVD nowadays. It's easier for them to smuggle and then to understand it and just observe the culture, right? And that's how they change their mindset. They even try to wear like a South Koreans. The makeup, industry now is different, and they started to use the term of oppa rather than calling dongmo, the comrade. So these kind of things really quickly changing people's mindset. The soft power, they're changing the minds, right? What aid workers can add up there is to seed and to provide the concept of a human rights. In North Korea, they even don't have the term of human rights. They don't understand what human right means, right? They are violated their human rights, but they don't realize, they know something's wrong. They know they are having hardship, but they don't know they have a right to have their human rights, right? That concept is not there. So having this cultural influx and having aid workers as a human engagement, and they can now change people's mindset and know that's how this human engagement is important. So for me, aid to North Korea is not only providing finance or food or the necessities, but it's more about bringing different culture into North Korea. And North Koreans know that. North Korean regime knows that. That's why they prohibit aid workers to contact with ordinary people. They prohibit aid workers speaking in Korean. They prohibit these people come and do the monitoring. Right? They are not stupid. They know that. They know that would change. That would be the game changer. And my argument here is that because we are having sanctions, no, aid workers can't go into North Korea, and they can't do this human contact. They can't do this human engagement. But what we need to see in North Korea is those kind of engagement more and more, because we saw the changes from the Korean cultural influx in North Korea already is proven, right? So that is why I argue that sanctions on North Korea are not working in the same way as it was expected in other countries, because the situation is different. And what we need more is because the situation in North Korean society is different from other countries. So we need to have more aid in terms of not only to provide support, but also to build up more human engagement and also having more influx, the cultural influx in North Korea.
So by doing aid, by providing aid, that's almost like a proxy for human interaction, because the aid has to take place. And then that human interaction is also then the step before the ideas get placed in North Korean people's heads. So it's like distilling or disseminating these ideas of freedom, of human rights, or something like that. So it's I've always found it very interesting to consider the history of development. We've talked a lot about money as going through the arrival of new ideas in a society. So I've been here in South Korea while this idea of sabasa and honbap and honjok, this idea of individualism, and it's like, and gapjil and Korean people, like all of a sudden, it was there before, but it was never expressed with neologisms and cultural terms, this idea of individual desires taking precedent over the collective good. And so I found it fascinating how ideas change things as much as economics. And do you think that that's it, Sojin? Do you think it's about an idea? It's about these people understanding these concepts? Or is it more complex than that?
It's a lot more complex than that. That's why it's really not easy to write things down as a book or something, because it's really complex. Yeah. And nowadays, whenever I see BBC news about Ukraine and Russia, I am really more and more puzzled, because there is a girl, there is a daughter who called her mom in Russia and telling her mom that Russia invaded Ukraine. It was not legitimate. And people are suffering and dying for nothing. And mom in Russia didn't believe it, because from the news in Russia, telling her a different story. And she's so firm not to believe her daughter who has their own experience, just escaped from Ukraine because of the bombing and shelling, right? Even though her own daughter telling her mom that, crying, this is true, but then mom doesn't believe it because she doesn't see it. This is how easily people's mind can be manipulated through the media. Yeah. And that's what is going on in North Korea. Is huge, right? So more and more people come into North Korea and then, working on that way, then kind of see it, not only idea, but the fact that, what I see today from the news can be not true. That kind of question. What I hear from the government, is it always true or not? They even do not question it, right? Because it's not in culture. But that kind of seed needs to be there. That is more complex than the way, because we have many other things to think about, the surveillance system and how people grew up, and this new millennials and the mobile phone usage, and the Jangmadang generation, they do not think, and they not challenge the government necessarily, but they nowadays have a double talk, and they kind of know that the government approach can't be always right or true. So all these things, I see certain components of factors there, but they are not quite knitted in a way well yet, and we knit them well, and that is why we need to provide more influx. But the sanctions currently just cut all these connections.
Real life is messy and complex. It's hard to find clear definitions and sentences and theories and things like that. It doesn't work like that. It's really hard. And so is your work on civil society in North Korea, is it academic? Is it written in aspiration? Does your heart or your head tell you certain things that in your lifetime North Korea will have civil society? So I guess I'm asking, is it a theoretical academic exercise? Is it based on your expectations or your desires? Sojin?
It's all mixed in a sense. Well, of course, I'm writing a book as an academic, so the argument needs to have the supportive evidence, which means, writing it academically. But at the same time, I know that many of other scholars will hugely abandon my arguments just easily like that. And, it's not the first time for me, because whenever I call North Korea as a fragile state, I have a huge, critics saying that North Korea is not fragile state. It's not fragile state. It's not fragile state. My argument is mixture of that. in theory, North Korea is a fragile state because I do not see North Korean regime as a state.
Mm-hmm.
North Korea is as what's said is impossible state as a state. It's not state. So that's why I argue in that way. But at the same time, from my observation in other countries and from my experience, it's a society where human beings live.
Yeah.
And it's unfair for us to just sacrifice them and then leave them alone, right? And if there is a certain possibility to try, and why not? Because already we tried the sanctions for a long period of time, I think is enough. Mm-hmm. And North Korea developed nuclear power more and more, not lessened, right? Mm-hmm. Then right. Now it's maybe time to try something else. And if it doesn't work, anytime we can go back and, impose the sanctions again, if that really proved like, because no, I can't say that I'm right, so I can be wrong, right? Yeah. So in that sense, I'm trying to argue, even though there are many resistance around me, even my colleagues, challenge me all the time, persuade us. But I'm not arguing I'm not arguing this to persuade someone. I'm arguing based on the hope that at least someone should do this. Right. For example, when I did my PhD about Chinese aid, many people around me told me it's really difficult. You don't have data access, you don't have many access to data. Not many people working on that. Why you're doing? Not many people are interested. But then nowadays, voila, many people just talk about Chinese aid, right? Right. I strongly believe that sooner or later there will be some need to change because now people worked on North Korea for quite long, but the data source is very limited. But the society should change, and I see there's a potential to change. So that's why I'm trying to argue in this way. Well, I don't know, after the book comes out, then there can be a huge, really difficult critics around, or even the publishers do not want to publish this. I don't know, but yeah, for me, that is something necessary to be done.
I'm reviewing books for NK News these days, so I look forward to reviewing it. Give me give me a copy.
I saw your recent one on the Bruce Cummings, and I saw your the headlines. Oh my god! I was like, if David sees mine, and what he said, this is nothing new as well.
I saw this meme on the internet the other day, Sojin, and it was like person A, person B. Person A does a 4-year master's degree, starts a PhD, does 5 years field research, spends 2 years researching, writes a dissertation, completes the book, publishes and shares their research online. Person B sees the research, bullshit. And it's just like you put your whole life and work into this thing, and then someone on the internet says rubbish. That's life sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, I recently received an email from someone from nowhere saying that because of academic like you, the students are suffering because your argument is bullshit. It was really nasty critics without, but yeah, people have different ideas, different thoughts. Fine. Just I hope that at least someone takes this reasonable and sensibly, so that and hopefully my argument is right, so that it can be implemented and see some changes.
It's definitely something worth talking about. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And once it comes out, I'm looking forward to it. Just when we talk, Sojin, about these responses sometimes we get working in academia and how things transpire, I just want to very quickly talk about Korean studies as like a field, because we're both kind of like in Korean studies, but you're the co-director of the International Institute of Korean Studies, senior lecturer. Like, I've asked you your opinion on South Korea, on North Korea. Now, if I look at Korean studies as a field, do you look at that with pride, with apprehension? How do you observe this field here of Korean studies?
My view on Korean studies can be something different or slightly new compared to those who were in Korean studies for a long time, because I didn't start my career path as a Koreanist in the field. I started my career in a development studies discipline, then jumped into the Korean studies. And it was possible because Korean studies is interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. But when I moved to UK for Korean studies, many of my academic colleagues told me, oh, so you're going to teach Korean language. That was the immediate response. So for many of the Koreans, Korean studies are teaching Korean, right? In Europe, it's more developed in a way. Language is base. So Korean studies in area studies, if you think about the disciplinary approach, is area studies. And most of area studies, for example, Chinese, Japanese studies, they all started from language. Then language became the base, then backbone of the studies, and it coming with the more other aspects. But still for Korean studies, many people consider it as a Korean studies is a language and literature and history. So if you see the Korean studies in Korean universities, many of them are very focused on the literature and history.
Right.
But nowadays, especially because I'm in the European institution, it's not only about the language, literature, and history. It has everything Korea about Korea: economy, politics, IR, society, culture, media, films. Nowadays, especially music. The Korea studies is multi, and it has overlaps. So for me, I work on Korea's economic development, political development, economic politics. That overlaps with my other side of the development studies, and that features in. So I normally say to my PhD students, you are in development studies, but also in area studies with Korea as your case study. That's why you can also call yourself as a Korean studies person. So this is how I see the Korean studies. But still, I understand that many, especially in South Korea, sees Korean studies very limited scope. And because of that, many founding members of Korean studies from Korea are linguistics academics or history or literature academics. But nowadays, more and more PhDs having case in Korea, increasing number working on North Korea, and also different disciplinary approach they use for their case. So they themselves can become Korean studies academics or scholars, but at the same time in their own discipline, sociology as well, anthropology as well. So that's how I see the Korean studies.
I think it's really good that it's got interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. It's got more of that than beyond just the language and the history, which of course is important. And also people coming from different fields and using Korea as a case study, because that gives this really, it's not objective, but it's a different view, isn't it? It's almost that kind of outside in view. Do you notice any big differences in terms of English language, Korean studies discourse and Korean language, Korean studies discourse, or is it just the same thing in different languages, or does it transpire or manifest in different ways?
As I see, it's really different. So normally, as a Korean studies person in Europe, I do not communicate with academics in Korean studies department in Korea, but I rather communicate with academics in different department in Korea, working on Korea, like you're not in Korean studies department, but then you work on the Korean music culture as well. Then I tend to communicate with you rather than I communicate with academics in Korean studies department in Korea. It's because, as I said, they are pretty much limited scope there. And also here in the UK, for example, I receive PhD request proposals on Korea at my institution. They are all having different background, sociology background, anthropology background. I have a development studies background, international relations background, film studies background, public policy background. They are all, so it's really diversified nowadays.
Right. Hallyu affected it in any way? I get more and more students, Sojin, like coming into my classes going, I don't know anything about Korea, but I like Stray Kids. And I'm noticing more international students coming into the class just because they've kind of heard Korea before or they haven't interested in the music. Are you noticing in your end in the UK any changes from Hallyu, or is it not come in yet?
So I tend to make a joke. BTS, makes our life going on because BTS, students interested in BTS, and that's why they come here. That is just a joke. In reality, I actually did a survey with the freshman level students coming into university and the A-level students. A-level means high school students in Korea. Why you are studying on Korean studies? K-pop is not study. They don't want to study with something they enjoy, right? Then it becomes serious, and they can't enjoy it anymore.
Sure.
And whenever in open days, whenever we meet parents, they are worried. If my kid studying K-pop at your university, and are they going to have a good job? So the reason why they come to the university is not because of the K-pop. And then actually from the survey, it shows that most of them either just generally, I've been to Korea once and I just became so interested in Korea, I want to know more about it.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the history of Korea. I really want to do the MA in North Korean studies, but then I have to do the Korean studies here first. So that's why. Majority of them, I'm keen on something new language. Chinese too difficult. Japan too competitive. So that's why Korea. That was about 3 years ago. I did a survey. I don't think there are much difference in between 2 year time. So that's not only about the K-pop. Actually, only minor number of students responded to that. I ended up with the Korean studies because of the K-pop or K-drama or K-film. It was not the majority case. The majority case is a more, in a way, related to the job. I want to teach English in Korea, but I need to know Korea, which I don't take quite right to study Korean studies because you want to teach English in that, right? But anyway, that also was one of the reasons. I want to know more about Korea. I want to work in Korea. This is something different, new. Majority says something different, something new from so-called European language, right? Yeah. And most of them, especially coming from, for example, our university, because the BA level is focused on language first, then have the social science factors, that then it goes into the deep way for MA and PhD with more social science route. So many of them come here for their language, and then they see that is something different from what they used to be. So those are the main reasons for students to study Korean studies here.
How do they get on with the language? I mean, for me, it's still hard. I still study and I still try to... how do these students... I think it's age makes a big difference.
So, sorry.
It's okay.
Most of them, as I see more and more students coming with level of Korean proficiency already. So we have a very big gap, the freshman level, who really speaks Korean well, who already had a self-study in Korean, and who is really new to Korean. So it's really difficult to balance them well. So it really depends on individual level of Korean. So if they come along with well, then they ended up with a very good route based on the Korean, try to find the jobs related to Korea. But for some, they give up the language. Then they can go to the route which they don't need to speak Korean, but then focus more on social science way. So it really depends on the individual language capacity. But one thing for sure is that there are more female students than male students because it's associated with the language, and they tend to think language is perceived more easily for female students than male students. I think that's why.
It was the same for me in my Korean studies courses. Majority, like female. I was often the only man when I was studying, which is interesting. And I do like that idea about, you mentioned it earlier, when parents might come for Teachers' Day or something, and they don't want to tell their kid the difference between, imagine telling your parents, I'm studying North Korea, I'm studying Blackpink. They just sound cool. They're both really difficult, I think. But they sound different, don't they? Sojin, I realize that I've kept you a long time here today, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Like, I learned so much from you, and I'm going to want to have another conversation with you at some point in the future. Before we close out this conversation, I need to ask you the same question that I ask most of my guests, which is this question. We're all in this world together. So what is the purpose of life? What should we be living for? What can we be doing to make perhaps our lives or other people's lives more valuable on this earth?
No, I'm really not a good person to ask that question because, as you saw, my responses didn't sound very scholarly or very academic, because I tend to be more like ordinary in a simpler way. Me, myself, in a way, my life has been better than others. But in a way, I also struggled a lot. There were many of difficult points and turning points in life which I had to endure. And at some point, I really seriously thought to take my life away because it was really hard at that moment for me to digest. But then now I know that there is a reason why there are things happening, and anyhow you overcome. But the next time the difficult time comes, it's more difficult than before. So it's always challenging, right? So because of this due course, I tend to ask myself, why do I live? What people live for? I even ask my mom, why do you live? What do you live for? Your life was not so happy. You had to sacrifice alone as a female wife in Korea, with your parents-in-law in the family, and as a working mom, all these things. Now I think people live life to try to find the answer. And maybe the time when the last moment comes, then they would realize why they lived. I don't know how I would feel like, when I have that moment. But yeah, I'm still looking for the answer. And maybe that is the life, you try to find out the answer for your life, the reason for your life. So see, as I said, I'm really not a good person to ask this question because I really don't have the answer for that, because I still am questioning very often times to me, when the sky is clear like today, and I see outside, I'm not religious, by the way, but then I kind of feel like there's the existence of God, and then I just say, thanks God, giving me this beautiful day today. But then, sometimes, if I struggle with the people, and why you are so unfair, and why this kind of people, hassle me around, and why should I suffer,
Yeah.
So all this, and then, at the same time, I look around, and, people in Ukraine, why they should suffer like that, what is the reason? So it becomes all philosophical, and then I'm just going into the rabbit hole by myself most of the times. I think that is life, basically. You struggle, and you have happiness, and you then realize, but then you forget, and then you make mistakes, and then realize, and all these things, combination of things, and then you learn throughout your life, then maybe hopefully have the final good answer in the end.
Writing the book as we go along, I think, basically, aren't we? Yeah. Sometimes it's blue skies, and sometimes it's that really deep rabbit hole. Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite answers, Sojin. It's honest, though. But I feel the same though sometimes. Like, I'm not particularly religious. I'll look at the sky sometimes, and I'm not sure what you call them actually. Like Jacob's ladders, when the sun comes through the clouds, and you see those. You know what I mean?
The Cloud9 thing kind of thing.
Yeah, I see those. I'm like, wow, the world's amazing, and then the next day, the world sucks.
Yeah, so. I hate people. Oh, I love people. Oh, I hate people. Oh, I love people. Yeah.
Yeah. That's life, isn't it? Sojin, thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you. It was really enjoyable, and for a while I didn't have a good kind of a conversation because I'm mostly isolated nowadays, and I'm on my sabbatical especially, so I tend to think about my book and being miserable because of this Putin and everything. But it was really enjoyable for me too. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.